Hello, everyone, and welcome to the How Understanding Grief in the Body Supports Your Sobriety. I'm joined today by Monique, who is a yoga teacher and author of the book, The Grief Practice. Welcome, Monique.
Welcome, thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm so excited to talk to you about the subject of grief today. I truly believe it's very vital information that every human needs. So generally speaking, the opposite of addiction is conscious connection. So we strengthen our sobriety when we move closer to ourselves. And anytime we have human experiences we don't understand or emotions and feelings that overwhelm us, these are the times when it really can pull at our sobriety. Knowledge, understanding, perspective, I feel are key. The more we understand our bodies and connect, the more we self-empower. So I feel like grief literally is its own category. I feel like it's very unique. It's almost like it has its own DNA. Before we dive into this topic, I do want to, with that said, take a moment for everybody that is here on the call today to connect with themselves, connect with the breath, connect with the space that they're in, and also the other women who have joined in today. So with Monique's permission, I would like to read a passage from her book, The Grief Practice. If everybody could just close their eyes and connect to breath at this moment, and just take a nice, soft, and calm breath, and with your eyes closed, connect to yourself and connect to the women that have joined in today as I read this passage from her book. Our stories of grief begin long before we lose. They begin with the ways we were raised, loved, accepted, or rejected. They begin with the ways we were taught to be proper and sane, and the things we were taught to sweep under the rug. They begin with the silence in our homes and in our hearts about everything that ever mattered but was never spoken. They begin with the people who listened or turned a deaf ear to our early heartbreaks, the ones that taught our heart what it can expect from the world. They begin with the shame that was planted just under our skin, the kind that keeps us from trying or speaking, reaching in or reaching out. They begin with love, the unconditional, incomparable, unsurpassable kind that we're gifted as children or find as adults. They begin with us. Our stories of us shape our stories of grief. And although they are stories of how things ended, they are also stories of how we begin. Again, from here, with the hearts on our sleeves and the truth in our throats, this is the story of grief. Take another small, calm breath, and when you're ready, open your eyes. So your approach, Monique, to open yourself up to yourself, lean in and nurture grief, so crucial. You have a gift for explaining grief that is very eye-opening, and you also go against the grain, almost going against the culture in ways, as grief sometimes is always something that we have to fix or we have to get over. And I really appreciate that about you as well. Can you begin by sharing your personal story of grief with us?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I just love that you shared that piece from the intro of the book, because it really captures pretty much everything that I've learned about grief to this moment. But yeah, I'm really passionate about giving a voice to grief, because the biggest experience with loss that I had was in my 20s. When I was 25, my husband suddenly died, and it was unexpected, and it was a very traumatic experience for me. And kind of like that passage says, our stories begin long before we lose. And so for me, I met that moment when he died, very unresourced and unconnected from my body and really from myself. I had a history of major depression since I had been a teenager. And at that point, I had been on antidepressants for 5 years. And so it was just, as it is for many of us, a very overwhelming experience. And because I didn't feel understood or welcomed into society as I was, this is back in 2002. And so there was not the online communities and resources that we have now. So I really felt like there was nobody like me, especially being that young of a widow. And so over years, I isolated myself, and I had a stretch of feeling very suicidal. And about 5 years into that, I connected with yoga and some mindfulness practices, and they really just helped me find my first step. And that's, kind of goes on from there. But it was such a powerful experience of me coming home to me. And it wasn't a version of me that I really wanted. It was a very difficult place to start, but I just kind of felt like actually connecting with that truth, even though it wasn't very pretty or easy, was exactly what I needed to be able to begin.
So when you first started that connection to self with yoga, can you tell us a little bit more about that, what that experience is? I think that a lot of times we talk about, how we, especially in yoga, how beautiful it is. And I think that there's not a lot of talk about how the ugly parts of it, if you will, like the destruction that happens. And I love being honest about this topic because it's very helpful for people. So do you have can you share any of that? Any honesty with that?
Yeah, I also love to kind of name the darker side of things, because yoga is, it's kind of sold as come and feel good. And I often say that I think one of the best kept secrets about yoga is that sometimes we feel worse. And that's okay, because feeling worse doesn't always mean that we're doing worse. The first year I did yoga, at the final, relaxation at the end of the class, I just would cry. And in that moment, at that time, I didn't even know why I was crying. But looking back, I can definitely see that the mindful movement and the awareness was really allowing things to move, energy, emotion, sensations to move through my body in a way that I could actually contain it for the first time. And it had a free flow. And so it was a very moving practice for me. Like, moving allowed me to be moved in a way that I had never experienced before. And I had so many, different experiences. I feel like another thing that is often built up is, like a meditation practice. And I find, there's so much benefit to mindfulness and meditation. But when we come to yoga with a history of anxiety or trauma, those practices aren't necessarily the best place to start for everyone. And sometimes more, grounded practices, that give us more options, can feel like a safer entrance into the body and into the mind. And so, yeah, it was, when I started yoga, before I started yoga, I had started to learn to surf, and there's such a opposite. It's like the surfing to me felt very free and open, and like the ocean was the only thing big enough to contain what I was feeling, like it could match me. And then I started to do yoga, and something about it spoke to me, but I almost really hated going into the small little room and like feeling almost trapped, but somehow I knew I needed both, so I stuck with it. But especially when we have, you know, experiences of profound loss, it looks different for everyone. And for me, it ended up being yoga, but you know, it definitely is a unique path for everyone.
So you talk about body, mind, vagus nerve, traditional Chinese medicine. Can you give people tonight a crash course on what that is and why we should know about it?
Yeah, I'll try to not run off. So I guess I would start by saying that often we look at an experience of loss as being like in our heads, you know, that because we're able to rationalize everything, most things in our life through the stories that we tell about it or the way we think about it. And grief is so different. And I think I like to use those really sciences to support the very valid experience of grief in our bodies. And the way I like to explain it is that grief, to me, it's not just an emotion. It's a huge experience. It involves our body and our mind and our psyche and all, you know, our social environment. But its roots are in our biology, because every human being has a nervous system, and our nervous systems are there. Well, specifically our autonomic nervous system is there to respond instinctively to our environments. And so when we look at something like grief, even though it's not, you know, we weren't in a car accident or we didn't have a physical necessarily thing happen to us, to our bodies, it often registers the same way. It can feel like a threat. It can feel like an overwhelming experience. And that triggers in our systems, depending on our history and the amount of social support that we have, certain responses. And so sometimes we might feel like we have a lot of anxious energy that's moving through us and we can't stop, and it doesn't really have a focus, but we feel maybe a lot of anxiety or just a big surge of energy. And that's a very normal thing that is a function of how our nervous system is responding to any, you know, given time in our experience. And other times we might feel like completely shut down, disconnected, isolated, kind of a little bit of what I was saying of my own experience. And that's also a function of our biology, of the way that our nervous system is responding to our unique set of circumstances at the time. And so I find that, you know, sometimes we're so hard on ourselves, like I'm stuck. I mean, I always would call myself, I was stuck for 5 years, you know, and it's easy to kind of start to this process of berating, like I should do this, all the shoulds. And I feel like when we understand that we have this instinct that kicks in, that is in many ways kind of, it's going to happen. We don't have a lot of control over it. It really reminds us that like our bodies are responding the best way they can. That system is there to survive. And so when we're in situations that we feel are overwhelming or are a threat to our survival, our bodies are going to respond. And so a lot of our coping mechanisms that flow from those states are ways that we're just trying to kind of manage from day to day. And so that's kind of one aspect. The biology of it, I guess I would say, is more of the vagus nerve and polyvagal theory, which is a really beautiful, I feel like, foundation upon which to lay the experience of grief, because it gives us a starting place that allows us to then look at things like the sensations and the emotions that we experience in the body. Like it's very common for people to feel like, you know, like they have something heavy on their chest, or they can't breathe, or they feel numb or disconnected from their body, or they want to know how they feel, but they don't. You know, there's so many ways that it can show up in our bodies. And I think that when we're so lucky to have so much science around these topics nowadays. And so it really gives validity to this, you know, neck down experience not to separate it from what's happening in our minds, but that they're related and they influence each other. Like our physical and emotional state influence our thoughts, and our thoughts also have the power to influence how we feel in our bodies. So the other piece that you mentioned was the traditional Chinese medicine. And to me, when I ran across that, it was such just a beautiful complement to more of the Western sciences, because they have this practice of assigning emotions to organs. And there's a whole way that they flow together. But for the topic of grief, the organs that are assigned to grief, they're paired, a yin and a yang, and one of them is the lungs and one of them is the large intestine. And then when we look at like the heart and the small intestine, they connect that with joy and also the lack of joy. And when I looked at like the anatomy of a human body, what I saw was that the lungs, like the left lung, actually the heart is encased in the left lung. And like when you look at the intestinal system, the smaller intestine is kind of wrapped inside the large intestine. And to me, that was the physical kind of manifestation of this bigger conversation around like everything can coexist. We don't have to exile one to have the other, like love and loss can coexist, and all of those bigger kind of philosophies. But I feel like it's viscerally at work in our bodies all the time anyway. So that's a little bit of how I start the conversation on how it shows up in the body.
So I worked at an acupuncture clinic for years. So when you touched on this piece, I was like, yes, it's so crucial. So can you help people that are listening understand a little bit deeper when you bring up the organs? Like, what does that mean? Is it hanging out there? Are we experiencing pain there? What does that mean when we're looking at specifically the intestines and the lungs?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before with polyvagal theory and the vagus nerve. And so the vagus nerve it's a nerve that starts it's a cranial nerve, it's the 10th cranial nerve, and it goes from our brainstem to almost all of our vital organs, so our lungs and our heart, our intestines, and many sexual organs, many more. And the interesting thing about that particular nerve is that 80% of the fibers of the nerve they communicate from the organs to the brain. So there's 10% that communicate from the brain to the organs. And so the way that's easy for me to think about it is like if I'm talking to a friend on the phone. So like if I call you, Terri, and I lose my job and I'm feeling very overwhelmed and I'm in a very emotional state, I'm calling and I'm like, this is how I feel. I'm so worried, I'm upset. And that's kind of like the organs communicating what they feel, like the sensation, to the brain. And then you, as the more calm friend, would probably tell me something like, it's going to be okay, how can I help, what can we do, all of that. And that's that's the power of our minds, the 10% that can then communicate down like soothing messages to the viscera, like the organs. And so when you look at different organs or different ways that we experience sensation in our bodies, it's really helpful to understand like that function, because we've all had a gut feeling, or we've had a sense of like butterflies in our belly, or we've felt like our throat gets tight when we're nervous and going to talk in front of a group of people. All of these different sensations that we experience in our bodies. And I have a little practice called mapping your grief that I do in workshops. And it's something that like once you're kind of grounded and present, you can take maybe a memory or something that feels available to you, and you can start to look for the sensations that show up in your body. And an easy way to understand it is, something like joy. Like if you think of a time that made you feel really happy and like welcome and joyful, it's pretty easy to see like the shift in the body. Like usually we smile and maybe we feel lighter, and there's all of these corresponding sensations to the feeling. And so that's what you know, kind of when we're having, for something like grief, when we're feeling like a heaviness in our heart, or we're feeling the whole range of intestinal maybe sensations or feelings, that they really have this way to connect up to our emotional state and to influence our emotional state. And that's why I often, you know, look at something like yoga and really any embodied movement or therapy, that it's a way to support our bodies. Like, they're already feeling what they're feeling. Nothing is wrong with that. It's fine. But how can we help them? Like, they're already doing the best that they can. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of what I would start with on the organs.
Is there anything in specific with, when it comes to yoga, that you, I guess, why do you like that modality, and why do you use that modality? What are you seeing with it, and what are you experiencing with it in particular?
So yoga is, you know, it's the thing that was helpful to me. And it's also, I feel like this is the practice of yoga is kind of built into the system of yoga. So many ways to regulate the body and to support the body. And so like when we look at actually what's happening in yoga, you have movement and breath work, and those communicate to our brains in what's called a bottom-up way. So, you know, there's kind of, I think Dan Siegel explains, there's the hand brain, and it's kind of like if you take your hand into a fist, and if you open it up, then the palm and kind of this thumb area is the limbic system, which is where our emotions and more of the instinctive responses live, more of that reptilian brain, mammalian brain. And then when you close the fingers, then this starts to become our neocortex, like the more developed higher brain. And when we're feeling very emotional or very overwhelmed with sensation and emotion, he calls it flipping your lid. So that instead of walking around like this with a more integrated front, you know, top and bottom, everything kind of working together, that it's more like this. And I think we all kind of know what that feels like. And so when you look at something like yoga, the movement and the breath work communicate from a bottom up approach to this palm area. And then you look at the mindfulness and approach, that's part of this more, the neocortex, right? Like the more highly developed brain. And so when you combine them together, to me, it's, you know, what I call a whole brain approach, so that you're actually inviting the whole brain to become more online, which is really useful because in my perspective, it allows us to have access to more parts of our innate healing resources, is how I think of them. And the other thing that happens in yoga that's very helpful is that, you know, there's lots of like cross-body, contralateral, cross-lateral movement, like twists and things like that. And, you know, anytime we're crossing the midline, we're inviting the left and the right hemispheres of our brain to come into a little bit more cohesive relationship. And I often think of it like a real relationship, where it's like sometimes we're just not always on the same page. And so all of those kind of, you know, they overlap in the whole function of a yoga class. And the physical practices in themselves, the breath work, the different kinds of strengthening and stretching, they all a lot of times free up certain areas, like certain supportive organs or supportive muscles that help our breathing or make our breathing a little bit more easeful. And like even just the social environment of coming into a space and practicing with other humans, even though you're not personally having to connect with them, is very soothing for humans, because we thrive off of connection. And so all of those things together, like I do a monthly grief yoga class, and one of the things that a woman who comes regularly tells me is like, I just feel like I can breathe. And to me, that's huge. And it's not just a function of like, we're doing things to help you, you know, be able to have more access to your breath, but it's also just coming to a place where you feel like you can bring your whole self. And so I feel like there's so many different elements that this ancient practice we've been experiencing it for thousands of years. And now it just gives us another way that we can support and regulate our physiology, which directly impacts our psychology, like our psychological health. So when we step into the body, whether it's yoga or Tai Chi or like a somatic therapy, we're really finding embodied resources, somatic resources, and then they translate to our perspective in the world, of the world, and they really kind of have a big impact on our brain health. So that's kind of how I approach yoga.
So grief obviously is something that we experience when, we have a death of a loved one. But I think that we often forget the other layers too. Maybe not layers, but, we experience loss of relationships. We have job loss, all different kinds of experiences that we have where we can be experiencing grief with. Loss of self is also a big one to me. Can you expand a little bit on what that means to you, especially on loss of self? I think in sobriety, I think that's a very big topic. We literally are stepping out of one chapter, moving into the next chapter. We're losing skin and stepping into a new skin. And there's a grieving process that happens where we lose our old selves. A lot of times we lose our old friends, our whole world. And I think that is a topic we need to talk more about. Do you have any insight on that, particularly loss of self and grief with it?
Yeah, I think that's such an important focus. To me, I think of grief as integration. And so I think of it as really a welcoming of all of our parts. And so I often hear, and I've used this language on my own too, where it's kind of like we need to release, or we need to like let go, or we need to like, purge, or like move on. And all of these, that's kind of how we've been raised in our society for most of us, is like we heal, and healing somehow has become like you're a better, different version, and then the other part is gone. And I've really kind of, I think, softened into this concept of integration, where like there is no part that needs to be exiled, and there is no part that is so bad that it cannot be included and carried forward with us and integrated. And I've done the last few months in my own somatic therapy a lot of work around this, because it's just really, I think it's human nature to kind of feel like, well, there's parts of us that, either the way this kind of goes back to like our coping mechanisms, they were so, not healthy or not useful, or they were so, we have so much judgment around them, and they may have not been healthy and not, something that we should sustain long term. But when you look at like, most of our coping mechanisms are there because of the state our bodies have dropped into because of our histories, so that we can survive. And so, yes, some of them are not very optimal, but like when we can appreciate that we're doing or are doing the best that we can with what we have, it doesn't mean we can't make different choices, but I think it lets us find a little forgiveness for maybe those parts of ourselves that feel like they need to be left behind. And I think that there is like definitely a place for the mourning process of, maybe more of that growing into who you are now. I definitely have that, over the years, where I felt like I've grown into a person that I wanted to be, but at the same time, there is this other, this old version of me that maybe I just really didn't have the time or the space to mourn and also appreciate and welcome. And really, I think of it a lot in like terms of actually seeing that person, because it was like in that time I was just so either judgmental of her or trying to escape her or trying to feel better. And you know, now sometimes from a different perspective, we can look back and actually, you know, almost like you would with your own child perhaps, and just kind of, you know, let them have a seat, let them even have a say. And I find that that can be really supportive of allowing all of our pieces to be integrated, instead of kind of going like, this is the good version of me, and then I'm going to move forward. Because I find that things tend to be, you've probably had a sense of this too, like things tend to be circular. And so yes, we get to like good plateaus in our life or whatever our process might be, but then we might have another loss, you know, or we might have another experience or something overwhelming. And all of those old things sometimes show up in a new way. And if we've had, you know, this practice or this process of like, I am beyond that, and now I am, you know, I'm this new person, sometimes it's hard to really allow for that kind of that sinking back into a different, you know, a different version of ourselves that's very similar to the one that we were like, nope, that one's over now. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of, I don't know if that spoke to your question.
I'm a big fan of the word evolving lately. That seems to be a big keyword for me that just seems to fit better. Because I really don't. I don't have a lot of regrets of, let's say, old self. Did some of those parts need to end so new parts could be, you know, come in? Absolutely. But it's all an evolution, you know, the evolving part. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about stigma around grief right now. I really think that we do as a culture have this like time frame, like almost like on a calendar, that whatever we're going through, we should be like, are you done with this now? Like, aren't you over this? Or months have gone by, or maybe even years have gone by, and people still are with their grief. And there's a stigma there that like, I'd love for you to expand upon, because I personally don't believe that there's a calendar date to it. I don't think that 2 months after a funeral, you should be over it. Or anything, really. I really can't pinpoint some point on a calendar to say this is when you should be over this. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know this is part of your mission, I believe, as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I feel really strongly that the more we can give a voice to the, you know, how unique it is, how unique of an experience it is, and the more that we start to shift the stigma. And thankfully there's lots of voices out there that are kind of, you know, teaching this new perspective on grief. But I think of it as any other experience we've had. Like it's never not part of us. In my experience, it's been about 18 years since my husband died. Like I've remarried, I have a son, and I continue to see it impact my life in good ways and in challenging ways. And it's also resurfaced at different points in my life. And when I had more resources that I was able to take on different pieces, I found even in the last 5 years that seeing other people have an experience of support and grief was able to like bridge this piece of my heart that I really thought was like unhealable. So that's been a very surprising experience to me, that even new, you know, 18 years later, like acknowledgement of my experience and seeing other people have support has felt healing to me. And, you know, if I had been like, it's 1 year and I am done, I would never have access to all that's been available to me. And it's just, I guess I can't emphasize enough that it's such a unique process. We talked about like our systems biologically, physically, emotionally, energetically, like spiritually, depending on the social circles we have, if we feel welcomed or understood, or if we feel isolated, like all of that changes our experience. It doesn't change that we've lost someone and that we're going to feel pain and hurt and all of these things about it. But it does change the experience of it as far as like the support that we have and how much freedom we have to express ourselves. And yeah, I really, one thing that I loved seeing, even though it was a tremendous tragedy in California, we had the helicopter crash, and it was because it was a public celebrity along with 8 other humans. It was given a place in the media that was huge. And to me, when I was watching it, I was really like happy to see that people were able to see what it's like to be accompanied and understood in their tremendous loss. And to me, when I saw that, like nobody knew him, but because, like who knows a celebrity, but everybody had a similar experience of this is a tragedy and we're feeling this loss personally, even though we don't know him personally. And I felt like this is what's possible for every human being that has, that loses a person in death. And I think that we don't really appreciate our true capacity as humans because we don't really show up for it because we don't have to. But something, when it's a public experience like that, I think it really gives us this little like lens into what's possible and what we humans are really capable of, which is, supporting other humans in their tremendous experience, because it's something we all can relate to.
Wow. Yeah, that speaks volumes, and it makes me think, and I hope the people that are watching, what can I do next time, right? What can I do knowing what you just said? Do you think that for anybody who's experiencing grief in whatever way, are there any good questions you can ask yourself when you're going through grief?
Yeah, there's lots of questions. I always kind of, in my process and in my practice, I always like to check in with where I actually am, which is different often from where I want to be or where I was. And by that I mean, like, sometimes people will reach out to me and they just had a loss like a week prior, and it's a normal human response to like reach out for help and try to mobilize around that. That's super healthy. But I also think like we can't really take a step forward until we land. And when we lose somebody, sometimes that process of falling is quite a long time. And once we fall, then there's like this collapse that often gets rushed. And like just checking in with like, am I falling? Am I in collapse? Am I somewhere, what step am I on? What do I need from here? Because even when what we need is not available, sometimes we can create it, sometimes we can ask for it. But if we don't do the check-in, we don't know. And we have a lot of power and ability over our external environment, but only, like when we understand what we need and how to proceed in that, in our given set of circumstances and with what we have. So I think, like, where are we really? And then also understanding, just kind of getting an awareness of like, what is the state that my body's in? Because if we're in, it usually comes down to 3. One is I'm feeling really supported and connected. I might not be happy. I might be really sad, but I feel like I have support. I feel like things are going to be okay. And that's called our safe and social state. And then we have this other state that's kind of more, I think I mentioned in the beginning, but it's a little bit more sympathetic energy. So we're feeling more anxious and more, maybe a little bit less supported and more stressed. Things maybe are triggering us more easily. And from that place, the world will look a little bit different. And then there's this third state that our bodies can move into, which is kind of a more depressed, more isolated, less connected. We might feel like, the world, like things are so hard, nothing's going our way. And so they're all fine. Like we don't need to change anything. But if we can get an awareness around like, this is where I am, there's nothing that needs to change. But, how do I get curious about this experience? And curious, within the realms that don't feel too overwhelming, because that's particular to grief, is that a lot of times we feel like, if I feel this, I will never come back. Like if I go there, I know I felt that, like that's the end of the world. And it might be because we don't have enough either internal or external support to explore a feeling or an emotion or a memory, and that's fine. Like back to the timeline thing, it can, it will be there, and a future time might be better for us to unpack certain things. It might just not be the right time,
Can I get curious? I like how you're saying that. And that's it. In that moment, if I can recall any of my multiple moments of severe grief, to move closer to it and be curious about it. I think that's a quick, easy thing to remember, and a beautiful, beautiful thing. Do you have any favorite yoga poses that you love and would recommend people to do? I'm envisioning some type of static or restorative pose that anybody listening this evening can keep in their toolbox to kind of pull out medicinally if they need it, whenever they need it. If they're experiencing grief, that would be your favorite kind of pose, your go-to pose.
Oh, that's such a good question. It's really hard to narrow it down, but I would say, can I have two?
Yeah.
So where I am in my teaching and in my practice now, I really find a lot of benefit in actually finding strength in the body. Because when we actually feel strength in our muscles, we have all these receptors around our joints that communicate also to our brain that things are okay, like on a physical level, a muscular level. And so sometimes what I love to do is just like lying on your belly. You're just going to lift off your belly, and you can have your hands along your sides, and you can have them, you could even place your hands by your ribs if you wanted. It's kind of whatever's comfortable, but you just start lying on your belly, and then just kind of start with your head. Just lift your head, and then maybe your neck, and then maybe your throat, and then really see if you can use like the muscles along your spine to lift up maybe your shoulders and your upper chest. And can you breathe through your nose while you're doing it? To me, that's a really simple way to both ground the body, because your whole pelvis is rooted into the ground, but also recruit strength along the paraspinal muscles along the spine, that just remind the body, like, you can do this, like you can get through this, and that there is still embodied strength even when we emotionally feel like, overwhelmed sometimes. There's so many restorative practices. The other one that I was going to mention, if the breath feels easy for people, I always like to mention that sometimes the breath feels agitating, but if it feels like an easy focus, there's a double exhale. So you would just lie on your back with your knees bent and your feet on the floor, or maybe your feet are up on a chair, your lower legs are up on a chair or a couch, and you're just lying on your back. And you just take a normal breath in, and then you take a normal breath out, and then you take another breath out, like a double exhale, and you really push all the air out. And then you just let the inhale just rebound naturally. And you just try that a couple times, but you're really on the second exhale, you might feel like your anterior core muscles really helping you to push the air out. And it's contracting your diaphragm so that when you don't force it, the inhale just kind of fills up that space. A lot of times you'll feel like you have a much bigger breath or much more space to breathe, which can feel different for everybody. But those are two that I really usually include in almost every class at different times, because I just find them very supportive for, grief can make us feel so hopeless and can take away our breath. And so I feel like those are just two physical ways that we can support our body's ability to take in air and to remember its own strength.
So on your website, you have a couple goodies. Do you want to mention those? I know you have some videos on there. Can you tell us a little bit about that so people can take advantage of those goodies?
Yeah, I do. I think I have 4, maybe 5, but they're free videos. I have a supported yoga sequence. It's about an hour, and it's, as you mentioned, it's more resting postures. And that's really nice if you're feeling in a really exhausted state energetically. You don't have to do big movement. You can just be supported and still get the physical benefits from the practice. And then I have an active sequence, an active yoga that is, a little bit more energetic. And I have a shake and ground, which is nice for moving some energy through the body. And all the videos, I think there was a Mother's Day practice this last year. So if you, I think it's just like you sign up and then you get all the videos for free. So there's that. And then there's a space, it's like my favorite space on my virtual home on that website, but it's just a place where if you have a story that you want to share, or a sentiment or a thought or a drawing or anything like that you want to give a voice to, there's a place that I publish those. And I find that stories are a really powerful way to put our voice into the world.
Do you have anything else you would like to add?
Usually I have so many things to say.
I could talk for like 5 minutes.
Yeah. I think, yeah, we covered some. I love that we were able to cover so much of, touch on all the aspects. I think of it as like a blending of science and soul, because to me they really kind of overlap and give validation for such a profound experience. But I think we touched on all of the things that are usually things I like to name.
So you have a website, Monique Minahan.com, and then also thegriefpractice.com, correct?
Yeah, so the thegriefpractice.com is the one with the videos and the stories that I mentioned, and then the other one is my personal website that has more of kind of like the regular yoga classes I teach and things like that, but they both have a lot of information.
And then what is your social media? How can people reach you on there and stay connected? I love your Instagram. I mean, if anything, the very little that you could do this evening is go follow her on Instagram and just get that into your feed and absorb it. I feel like you are dropping a lot of nutrients every day in your posts that people need to hear and absorb. So where can they find you?
Yeah, that's like my little baby, at the Grief Practice on Instagram. I started that maybe 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. And I literally grew it from like 0 followers. And I just, I post about 5 days a week, and it's a combination, of science and soul. And so sometimes it's poetry, sometimes it's stuff that we've talked about related to the body, but I really think of it as a resource now, because there's so many, 1 or 2 liners that they'll either resonate with you or they won't. But if they do, there's bigger explanations that just, we all need reminders. And I really find that I've gotten a lot of good feedback, and I think it's just vital for us to keep supporting ourselves and reminding ourselves that our bodies are doing the best they can. And to the extent and ability and privilege that we have, we can help that process. And, the social networks are so wonderful for just letting us get a little bit of, encouragement on our way.
So your book, I don't know if you can see it, it's The Grief Practice. I literally should be hired to be your saleswoman, because I can't get enough of this book. I love this book. It has personal stories, and actually that's how I got connected with Monique, is because the story of my mother's death is shared in the beginning of here, along with several other people. But also, and I have to say this, when I submitted that. I thought it was going to be a book, and it was going to be all a book of stories. And when this arrived on my doorstep and I opened it up, I literally started crying. I was like, this, yes, like I just lost all words. I didn't even understand what you were all going to do with this book. And it was of a great surprise to, yes, there's stories in here, but Monique goes into further explaining the things that she has talked about today. She gives you the practices in here, and it is just a beautiful, beautiful book. And it's also a workbook that you can write in as well. And I mean this bottom of my heart that this needs to be in everybody's hands. There's a lot of vital information in here that can help us all. And to quote you, grief is a practice, not a problem to fix. It's a practice of being human. So thank you, Monique, for being here today. I greatly appreciate your time. I am so happy that we shared space today.
Me too. I thank you for everything. I'm really glad that we had this conversation, and that we've been connected in all these different ways. Thank you, Terri.